for more context, let's bring in our next guest, Kendrick Robbins. Kendrick, he's an adjunct professor of national security strategy at the American Security Project, and he also served more than 20 years in the U.S. Army and also served as a special assistant to the Army Chief of Staff. We've already started to see some of the fallout for this, but before we get to where we go from here, let's talk about how we got to this position in the first place. And I found it interesting. I'm going through Bergen's new book, which gets an insight to some of the generals that were in the Trump administration, at least in the beginning of his term. And specifically, Mattis tried to either slow play or even stop some of the worst impulses the president had as to escalating issues with Iran. And he intentionally didn't put options on the table that were so extreme here that normally would dissuade a president to more of the moderate positions, but he was afraid he would take it. How much of the situation we find ourselves is that there is no more Mattis, there is no more Kelly, there is no more McMaster, there really is no one surrounding the presidents with some ground knowledge of what it was like in the Middle East from personal, first-hand experience?
Yeah, that's a great point, Richard. I think what's going on right now in the administration is with General Mattis gone, Mark Esper is a great American, but he doesn't have the strong personality that a General Mattis had. You also see John Bolton's not at the table anymore, and the current national security advisor, again, not as strong a personality. So I think clearly the president is leaning very heavily on Secretary Pompeo. I suspect that Secretary Pompeo weighed in very heavily, and without those other advisors, kind of at the table to discuss this, it's likely the president is listening very closely to Secretary Pompeo and maybe not as closely to others.
To that end, I thought it was interesting. By all accounts, Soleimani's a horrible guy, and I think, at least from the people I've spoken to, I defer to you, a legitimate target. It seemed that this was avoidable in that we didn't have to be alone in this. I found it telling that two of the groups that we would think would be, doing cartwheels over this, the Israelis as well as the Saudis, who have huge issues with Iran, neither of them said, yeah, we're with you on this. They said this was America's action, and while they don't miss that Soleimani's gone, they made it clear that they didn't have fingerprints on this. Moreover, none of our other allies, and this has been, I guess, 3 years in the making with NATO, et cetera, forget about we're consulted, but we're ever brought in on this. It seems, I don't know the upside when the Iranians now say they're talking about, they're going to pull out completely out of the nuclear accord. Maybe, they're on the road to getting a nuke. Moreover, here, we've shut down all forward operations where we're training partners, and moreover, we're going after ISIS. Now, we're basically retrenching, waiting for the reaction from the Iranians. To me, I guess my only point is, it didn't have to be this way, did it?
Well, we certainly have had the option of taking out General Soleimani in the past. Other presidents have had this option and passed on it because of the what they feared would be a severe strategic reaction from Iran and the consequences of that. And to your point earlier, yes, I mean, General Soleimani is not a good guy. We've known what he's done, especially against U.S. forces during Operation Iraqi Freedom and training militia forces to attack them. But the timing of this, and again, the concern, I think, from a lot of folks right now is justified, which is what is the larger strategy that the U.S. is going to have in place in regards to Iran? What are we trying to accomplish from a strategic standpoint? You cannot use military force as the sole option as you're trying to reach a strategic decision or a strategic outcome. You're going to need diplomacy. You're going to need other elements of national power. And it's going to have an impact, in the very short term in our fight against ISIS, because all of our military forces in the region right now are going to have to go into a defensive posture. They've got to focus on force protection. There's concern about a response. We're going to have to see, what they decide internally and whether they want to kind of satisfy internal domestic politics, or do they want to do something that will be seen as an escalation by the U.S., which might trigger another response.
Well, to that point and how they might respond, I think it's interesting. We go back to September, and on those Saudi oil reserves that were attacked, and most people believe, and I think rightfully so, the Iranians had their fingerprints on it. The quantum leap, as it was described in print today, that these drones have for precision and how far away that they can be sent from, Now, especially since we do have a lot of military positions as a result of what happened just a few days ago. Talk about that as a concern, because obviously we're the overwhelming superpower here, but there's been an advent in technology that allows even Iran at its capacity right now to do a lot of damage here and from distance.
Absolutely. I mean, the Iranians do have one of the largest, I think maybe the largest missile force in the area. They have not been very accurate with those weapons, but certainly they now have possessed drone technology just like we have, and they can use those drones to attack. And I think that's really where the concern is right now, or the analysis is going is will the Iranians, attack a U.S. military base directly? That would be seen as probably an escalation of the conflict. And so they may choose not to go that route and attack a softer target with maybe strategic value, but not a direct attack on U.S. forces. I think the other thing we have to be concerned about is, General Soleimani was training a lot of these proxy forces throughout the region. Some of these forces may take some actions on their own as a result of this. And so they may not necessarily wait for, guidance from Iran, and they may want to strike back as a result of this.
So, and that leads me to my last question, because I think if there's two legitimate problems people have with this, I guess the third one in terms of there was never any consultation. There's been still to this day, we're still waiting for the compelling evidence that there was an imminent threat to troops here, especially when we're getting some counter evidence that there was some meetings that were scheduled that possibly could have de-escalated the situation that were going on. Be that as it may, it's like we're looking for a plan now after the attack. But then the other part is the president's insistence on spiking the football after this happened, talking about going after cultural sites. And we know this obviously in conjunction to some of the other things that he's already said right now regarding torture, etc. It doesn't that just make this even that much harder, where you're all but goading Iran to have to respond, not just with the killing, but also with how we reacted after the fact?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, the president's tweet about the cultural sites is very unfortunate. So I don't think that's the right answer. Fortunately for us, we have excellent military commanders, and we have great judge advocate generals. And so so the viewers understand when a military strike is going through an approval process, there are always lawyers involved. And one of the things they look at is that the target has to have military value. So you cannot strike a target simply, a cultural target simply because it's a cultural site. It has to have military value. So there has to be military forces hiding in that site or something along those lines. So I'm confident that at least our judge advocate generals and our military commanders are not going to attack a cultural site purely for a symbolic reason like that. But of course, it only creates more problems for the diplomatic efforts when the president says these things, because that's something that's very sensitive to everybody, but especially to folks in the Middle East. They're very sensitive to their cultural sites. And so this will likely, again, it will kind of stir up potentially the escalation. And it's unfortunate that he did respond in that way. But I think we should have confidence that our military forces are not going to do that. And I think the Secretary of Defense stated that pretty clearly just yesterday.
I just resent the fact they were even put in the position where they didn't even need to be. But Kendrick, thank you so much for a few. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.